So the question that I was asked to address today had to do with how we build diversity in the church, how we create a church community that is diverse. And I left this one till the end of this series because I didn't know the answer. Still don't know the answer. I've got some ideas. But I also left it to the end because it's something I struggle with. Because I recognize that me getting to be here comes from a place of my own privilege. Now, that's not to say that I've never faced any adversity or difficulty in life, but it's never been because of the color of my skin, my gender identity, my sexual orientation, the class status I was born into, the place in the world I was born into. So I am speaking on the topic of diversity as someone who has experienced a tremendous amount of privilege. But I also feel that if those of us who experience privilege in life never speak on these topics, nothing changes and we do some lasting harm. So I want to talk about how we create diversity in the church. But before I can do that, I've got to talk about the history. And I could go back to the 1800s and talk about the church's position on slavery, on the African slave trade, and how that divided the church in the 1800s, and how for so long Christianity supported slavery in the world. Or I could go back to the early 1900s when the church and the Klan were working in cahoots with one another so often, and so many clergy, especially United Methodist clergy, not United Methodist, just Methodist at the time, so many Methodist clergy were actively part of the Klan. But I actually want to talk about post-war America, because I think that might have more relevance to some of us who maybe lived into that time in history. I want to talk about what happened in the church in the 1950s and the 1960s, because so much of what we see in the church today is a result of that. I often talk about the idea that the church we have today hasn't changed much from the 1950s and 60s, and a lot of that has to do with what I want to talk about right now. In the 1960s, Dr. King talked about the most segregated hour in America was Sunday at 11 a.m. Because even as the civil rights movement was working to integrate so much of American life, the churches remained deeply segregated. And 2024, I don't know that that's changed a whole lot. I looked up one definition of what a multicultural church was. To be defined as a multicultural church, what did you need to have? And the definition I found said that for a true multicultural church, no one ethnic group could make up more than 80% of the congregation. So I want us to think this morning, how many churches in America today do we think are multicultural? What percentage? Anybody got a number? 5%? Oh, you're a pessimist. It's 8%. 8% of American churches in 2024 are considered multicultural if we use that definition of 80%. Anybody have a guess on how many of those are mainline Protestant? 2% of mainline Protestant churches are considered multicultural. The optimists say 3%. So if I'm only going back to the 1950s, I think we can identify something that happened in post-war America that didn't create the problem, but exacerbated it. You see, in the 1950s, churches boomed. Attendance rose like we've never seen it before. It was a real oddity, in fact, the number of people that were going to church in the 1950s. So much so that one denomination had a slogan, "A million more in 54." A million more people in 1 year. That was the goal of one denomination, and they more than met it. One of the strategies that the church was using in order to accommodate all these new people coming into the church was to create interest groups. They would create groups of like-minded people. So you had women's groups, you had men's groups, you had young people's groups, you had old people's groups, you had groups based on hobbies, you had mutual interests gathering together to form these small groups. Well, it's no wonder that you also started to have groups of different ethnicities that would only start meeting with people who looked and sounded just like them. These interest groups may have started off with the best of intentions, but so often they began to be formed into inclusive or uninclusive communities where only those who belonged. To put this into some context, this was the same time that a gentleman by the name of William Levitt was designing what we think of as the American suburb. He created places called Levitt towns. Some literally named Levittown. There is a Levittown, New York, that was very famously one of his communities. Very famously a community he would never have been allowed to live in. Because as he created these communities, the idea was that you would only live near people who were just like you. And William Levitt was Jewish, and Levittown would not allow you to live there if you were Jewish. You would not be allowed to live there if you were black. You would not be allowed to live there if you were Hispanic. You would not be allowed to live there if you were anything but white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. So, in this post-war America, you start to have these communities that are being intentionally formed around racist ideology, that you would only live near people just like you. And it wasn't just about language or skin color or accent, it was about class. You would only live in communities where the class structure resembled yours. So you can imagine, even when it became illegal to create these kinds of communities, where this racially segregated community became illegal, it became very hard to unentangle that racism. That we continue to this day to have communities that largely look very similar in terms of racial background, in terms of economic background, in terms of nationality. These communities, even though they are illegal today, continue to exist. So these segregated communities, whether it was legal or not, created segregated schools, whether they were legal or not. Created segregated civic organizations, whether that was intentional or not. And created segregated churches. One final issue that I want to address is how multiculturalism has often been done wrong. That churches that pushed multiculturalism oftentimes were simply pushing imperialism in disguise. Because church integration often came at the expense of cultural identity. Because you see, the way we worship is defined by our culture, often in ways we don't even realize. So often, a good felt desire for multiculturalism has stripped people of their language, of their music, of their dress, even their style of speaking has been taken away by this attempt to make a multicultural church. So oftentimes, multiculturalism has done more harm than good. One of the key issues we face in the world today, or at least in the church today, is this problem of tokenism. That in our attempt to be multicultural, we so often look for tokens of multiculturalism. I was watching a video with a young woman who's working on church leadership issues, and she talks about how often she is invited as the Asian person to sit on these big panels. That she's not given a voice, that she's not given any real power. They simply want her there so they look multicultural. So we've got all this history, all these concerns, and I simply needed to ask a question. Is diversity a Christian value? And I think yes, but I think it depends on how we define diversity. Because there's two ways that we can do that. We can define diversity as multicultural, or we can define it as intercultural. Multicultural is the idea that multiple cultures can coexist with one another. And that's a fine enough value. A lot of places still struggle with it, but it's a fine enough value. But I don't know if I call it a Christian value. Because as Christians, we are not simply called to coexist with one another. We are called to be in relationships where the barriers that divide us all come crashing down through the love of God. So multiculturalism is fine, but I think if I'm talking about a Christian value, I would say that we should be valuing intercultural work. Intercultural diversity is a fostering of mutual understanding between cultures. It's not to simply say that we are simply coexisting with one another anymore, but we are actively growing because we are forming relationships with other people. We are actively forming relationships with people who are distinctly different from ourselves. I think that's something the church should value. I think churches should strive to become intercultural because that is a Christian value. Because we value the imago Dei, the image of God. And we value that all people bear the image of God. And there are some consequences if we believe that. If we truly believe that every single person bears the image of God, there are some consequences to that belief. If my community is segregated, whether in law or simply in practice, then I am missing something of the essential nature of God. If my school was segregated, whether by law or simply by practice, then I am missing something of the essential nature of God. If my social circle is segregated, whether through intention or simply through cultural practice, then I am missing something of the essential nature of God. If my church is not open to all, and if my church's definition of all is limited, then I am missing something of the essential nature of God. So is diversity our goal in the church? I don't think it is. I think maybe diversity is the outcome. That when we work to create communities of inclusion, communities where all are welcome, all have a voice, all are valued, maybe that is our goal. To create these communities where all are valued. And the outcome of that goal is diversity. After Dr. King talked about Sunday mornings being the most segregated time in American life, he went on to talk about his own church, how his own church was not diverse. That his own church was very much made up of people who looked like one another, thought like one another, spoke like one another. But then he talked about the fact that his church was inclusive, that his church was welcoming to all, that it may not be diverse, but it was inclusive. If our goal is just to be diverse, we may miss out on the joy that comes from creating communities of inclusion. And we may fall into the trap of valuing diversity more than we value the sacredness of God that is found in all people. Valuing inclusivity matters. Creating a place where inclusivity is a core value matters, because it says that all persons are of sacred worth and all people are of value to the community. But at the same time, it honors our differences, our different cultures, our different backgrounds, our different histories. It doesn't try to eliminate those differences just to get to the point of diversity. But there's a paradox here. I believe that inclusivity eventually leads to diversity. But I also think that we need to encounter diversity in order to be truly inclusive. And for me, that means intentionally stepping outside of my culture and my comfort zone every so often. Creating a system where diversity leads to living inclusively, and living inclusively leads to a deeper and truer and more authentic diversity. I still don't know if I have the answer to do this. I don't know how we do this, but I know it starts by creating communities where we see the sacred worth of God in all people, where we give all people a voice, where we value all people's contributions, where we value the person rather than the hope for diversity, where we value the inclusion and trust that the inclusion will lead us to a greater diversity. Let's be in an attitude of prayer. Gracious God, what a great thing it is to have so many differences around us. That in our striving for diversity, we're not striving for sameness. In our striving for diversity, we are giving voice, giving agency, giving inclusivity a chance. Lord, help us to create a community where we are inclusive of others. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.